In Harmony Creek, a decorated veteran walked into a diner, and what happened next left the whole town in silence. John Carter was a widower for 7 years. His life had settled into a gentle, ordered pattern. Morning coffee on the porch, a walk through the town square to nod at neighbors, and twice a week a late lunch at Harris's diner. It was a ritual, a small connection to the life he'd shared with his wife, Martha. She had loved their apple pie. John, a decorated veteran of 2 tours, carried his service not like a badge of honor, but like a set of old, well-worn tools. They were a part of him, shaping the quiet set of his jaw and the steady calm in his eyes. He spoke little of what he'd seen overseas, but the town knew. They saw the discipline in his posture, the respect he gave and commanded without a single raised word. He was their moral north, the man you'd point to when explaining goodness to a child. On this Tuesday, the air was thick with the promise of a summer storm. The sky was a bruised purple, and the scent of ozone and hot asphalt hung over Main Street. John pushed open the glass door of Harris's diner, a small bell announcing his arrival. The familiar smells of frying bacon, stale coffee, and warm sugar washed over him. He saw Sarah, a waitress who'd been working there since she was a teenager, her face etched with a permanent, weary kindness. She smiled, a genuine flash of warmth, and gestured toward his usual booth by the window. "Afternoon, John," she said, her voice a familiar comfort. "The usual?" John nodded, sliding onto the cracked red vinyl. "Please, Sarah, and a slice of that apple pie if it's fresh." He laid his worn leather wallet on the table, a habit from a lifetime of readiness. The diner was half full, a few farmers nursing coffee at the counter, a family with noisy children in the back. The low hum of conversation was the town's daily soundtrack. From behind the pass-through window, a man emerged, wiping his greasy hands on a white apron. Tom Harris. He was the 3rd generation to run this diner, a legacy he wore with a mixture of pride and resentment. His face was perpetually flushed, his eyes small and suspicious. He inherited the diner from his father, just as his father had inherited it from his. He also inherited its prejudices, tending to them like a sour, bitter garden. Tom's eyes landed on John Carter, and the air in the diner shifted. The low hum of conversation faltered, then died completely. The farmers at the counter suddenly found the sugar dispensers fascinating. The mother in the back shushed her children with a new urgency. It was a collective intake of breath, a town bracing itself. Tom walked slowly toward the booth, his boots scuffing on the linoleum. He stopped beside the table, his shadow falling over John. He didn't look at John, but at Sarah, who stood frozen, coffee pot in hand. "He's not being served," Tom said, his voice flat and hard. The words dropped into the silence like stones in a still pond. Sarah flinched. "Tom, it's John," she whispered, as if the name itself were a shield. "I know who it is," Tom said, his gaze finally flicking to John Carter, full of something ancient and ugly. "We don't serve his kind here anymore." The phrase "his kind" was a poisoned dart, aimed not just at John's skin, but at his history, his service, his very presence in the town he called home. John Carter didn't move. His hands rested flat on the table, his posture unchanged. He looked at Tom Harris, his eyes not filled with anger, but with a deep, profound sorrow. It was the look of a man who had seen the worst of humanity in foreign lands, only to find it waiting for him at a lunch counter in his own town. "May I ask why, Tom?" John's voice was quiet, steady. It carried no tremor, no plea. It was the voice of a man asking for a simple truth. Tom's face tightened. He seemed to swell with a righteous fury, a performer playing to an unseen audience of ghosts. "My diner, my rules. I don't need a reason." The silence in the room was now suffocating. Every person in that diner was a witness, their inaction a verdict. They looked at their plates, at the floor, Anywhere but at the quiet veteran being publicly stripped of his place in their community. John held Tom's gaze for a long moment. He saw the fear behind the bluster, the weakness masquerading as strength. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of young men trying to justify the unjustifiable. He slowly retrieved his wallet from the table. His movements were deliberate, dignified. He pushed himself out of the booth, his back straight, his head held high. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked toward the door. As he passed Sarah, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of absolution for her helplessness. Her hand trembled, rattling the coffee pot. Her eyes were filled with tears of shame. As the bell on the door chimed John's exit, Sarah's hand, shaking with a mix of fear and fury, slipped into her apron pocket. Her fingers found her phone. With a clumsy, fumbling motion, she raised it, pointing the lens through the pass-through window at Tom Harris, who stood there, chest puffed out, a petty king on a linoleum throne. She pressed record. The video was shaky, the audio muffled by the hiss of the grill, but it captured the ugly triumph on Tom's face and the averted eyes of everyone else. It captured the silence. John Carter walked out into the charged air, the storm about to break. He felt the weight of every eye in that diner on his back. He felt the humiliation, a cold, sharp thing that settled deep in his chest. He had faced enemy fire, lost friends in dusty, forgotten places, and buried the love of his life. But in that moment, walking out of Harris's diner, he had never felt more alone. He got into his old Ford pickup, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. He didn't drive home. Instead, he drove to the bluff overlooking the town, the place he and Martha used to watch the sunset. He sat there as the first drops of rain began to fall, streaking the dust on his windshield. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a single name in his contacts. Michael. He just needed to hear his son's voice. He wouldn't tell him what happened, not really. He would just talk, let the sound of family wash away the stain of the last 10 minutes. He pressed the call button. Miles away, in a sterile Washington, D.C. office, a phone buzzed on a mahogany desk. Senator Michael Carter, a man who moved through the world with a surgeon's precision, saw his father's name and smiled. He excused himself from a meeting with a powerful lobbyist, stepping into the quiet of his private study. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice warm. "Everything okay?" John Carter tried to keep his voice even, but the hurt was a crack in the foundation. "Everything's fine, son. Just called to see how you were." Michael heard it instantly. It was in the pause that was a fraction too long, the carefully constructed casualness of the tone. It was the sound he'd learned to decode over years of long-distance calls, the sound of his father carrying a burden alone. "Dad," Michael said, his own voice sharpening with concern. "What's wrong?" And in the ensuing silence across 1,000 miles of telephone wire, the storm that had been gathering over Harmony Creek finally broke. It wasn't just a local squall. It was the leading edge of a hurricane, and it was heading straight for Tom Harris. The shaky video, sent anonymously from a burner email address, landed in the inbox of a young activist who ran a regional social justice blog. She watched it once, her heart sinking. She watched it a second time, her blood boiling. Within an hour, it was on Twitter. By morning, it was on the national news. The clip was only 45 seconds long, but it was devastating. It showed Tom Harris, smug and defiant. It showed the patrons of his diner, complicit in their silence. It didn't show John Carter, but his absence was the most powerful presence in the frame. Harmony Creek awoke to find itself infamous. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs lined Main Street, their bright lights turning the familiar storefronts into a hostile, alien landscape. Reporters ambushed locals coming out of the hardware store, microphones thrust in their faces. "What's your reaction to the video? Is this town racist? Do you support Tom Harris?" The town, so practiced in its silence, was suddenly forced to speak, and its voice was a fractured, defensive mess. Some mumbled about property rights and knowing the whole story. Others, their faces tight with shame, hurried past the cameras, offering no comment. The fault line that had always run just beneath the surface of Harmony Creek had ruptured, splitting families, friendships, and the town's carefully crafted image of itself. Tom Harris, initially panicked by the onslaught, found himself buoyed by an unexpected wave of support. A small, vocal contingent of the town rallied around him, painting him as a victim of cancel culture, a small business owner standing up to the politically correct mob. They organized a Stand with Tom rally outside the diner. The protest signs were a mix of defiant patriotism and thinly veiled bigotry. My diner, my choice. Don't tread on me. Support local business. Tom, emboldened by their cheers, gave a fiery interview to a sympathetic cable news channel. "This is my family's place," he declared, his face red with conviction. "My grandfather built it with his bare hands. We have a right to serve who we want. This isn't about race. It's about respecting traditional values." He was a hero to some, a villain to most, but either way, he was no longer just a diner owner. He was a symbol. And the pressure was immense. His suppliers started calling, their voices hesitant. A few long-haul truckers, who had been stopping at the diner for decades, found other places to eat. The bank that held the loan on his business, a large, faceless institution in another state, left a curt message about reviewing his accounts. Tom felt the walls closing in, but pride was a powerful anesthetic. He was a Harris. Harrises didn't back down. He didn't know that the real pressure hadn't even begun. He didn't know that the forces aligning against him were not a disorganized mob of protesters, but a disciplined, strategic operation directed by a man with a U.S. flag pin on his lapel and ice in his veins. Senator Michael Carter arrived in Harmony Creek not in a motorcade, but in a rented, dust-covered pickup truck. He wore jeans and a faded baseball cap, the disguise of a man trying to disappear. He didn't come to confront Tom Harris or to hold a press conference. Rage was a fire, and he knew fire was for burning things down. He was here to build. His first meeting was in the dead of night, in the empty parking lot of the town's closed-down textile mill. Sarah, the waitress, got out of her rust-pocked sedan, her body trembling. She clutched her purse like a life raft. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered, her eyes darting around the dark lot. "He shouldn't have done that to John, not to John." Michael looked at this woman, a person of no particular power or influence, who had committed an act of quiet, profound bravery. "You did the right thing, Sarah," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You gave the truth a voice. Now I need you to tell me everything, not just about that day, about Tom, about the diner, about the town." They talked for over an hour. Sarah spoke of Tom's mounting debts, the way he'd been cutting corners for years. She talked about his father, a hard, bitter man who had filled Tom's head with poison. She painted a picture of a man trapped by a legacy he was too weak to either uphold or escape. While Michael was gathering intelligence on the ground, his team in Washington was moving. They weren't political aides. They were a select group from his former life as a prosecutor and corporate lawyer, a forensic accountant who could smell bad debt from a mile away, a legal prodigy who specialized in shell corporations, a communications expert who knew how to shape a narrative without leaving fingerprints. Their war room was a secure conference line. Their weapons were financial statements and property deeds. The first report came from the accountant. "The diner's drowning," he said, his voice crisp. "Harris has leveraged it to the hilt. 3 separate loans, all consolidated and sold to a major investment bank. He's missed 2 payments. He's in technical default." Michael felt a cold surge of satisfaction. This was the leverage. This was the flank. "Form an LLC," Michael instructed his lawyer. "Something anonymous, untraceable. Name it Harmony Holdings." I want you to make an offer to that bank. We're buying the debt. Simultaneously, he tasked another researcher with a different kind of excavation. I want to know about Tom Harris's father, his military record, everything. Michael had a hunch. The kind of deep-seated generational prejudice Tom displayed wasn't learned in a vacuum. It was inherited. It had a source, a patient zero. He suspected the root of the poison wasn't in the diner. It was buried in the past, in the mud of a forgotten war. While the town of Harmony Creek was tearing itself apart in the glare of television cameras, the real battle was being fought silently, on balance sheets and in dusty military archives. Tom Harris was busy fighting the enemy at his front door, completely unaware of the army tunneling beneath his feet. The bank, a monolithic entity concerned only with its bottom line, received the offer from Harmony Holdings, LLC. To them, Tom Harris's diner was a non-performing asset, a small, risky line item on a spreadsheet deep in their portfolio. The offer from the LLC was to purchase the entire debt package for 90 cents on the dollar, a clean, immediate transaction. It was an easy decision. They sold the debt without a second thought. In an instant, the ownership of Tom Harris's financial fate changed hands. His new creditor wasn't a distant bank, it was his victim's son. And Tom had no idea. The call came on a Friday morning. Tom was in the kitchen, staring at a dining room that was nearly empty, the Stand With Tom crowd having dwindled as the news cycle moved on. The phone rang, and he answered with a gruff, "Harris's." The voice on the other end was polite, professional, and utterly chilling. It was a lawyer from Harmony Holdings, LLC. He informed Tom that his loan was in default and that the full balance was now due, immediately. "You can't do that," Tom sputtered, a wave of cold panic washing over him. "I have an arrangement." "Your arrangement was with the previous lender," the lawyer said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "We are the new lender, and we are calling the note. You have 30 days to remit payment in full, or we will initiate foreclosure proceedings." 30 days. It was a death sentence. He didn't have the money. He couldn't get another loan. He was ruined. The pride that had sustained him curdled into sheer terror. He was going to lose everything. The diner, his family's legacy, his entire identity. The news from the military archive researcher arrived in Michael's inbox the same day. It was a single scanned document, a heavily redacted after-action report from a firefight in the Mekong Delta, 1969. It detailed the death of Sergeant Frank Harris, Tom's father. The official cause was enemy action, but tucked into the appendices were witness statements that told a different story, a story of chaos, confusion, and a terrible mistake. Frank Harris had been killed by friendly fire from his own platoon. The report also contained a recommendation for a posthumous medal for a young black soldier, Private Reginald Carter, who had braved enemy fire to try and pull Sergeant Harris to safety, getting wounded in the process. Michael's breath caught in his chest. Reginald Carter was his uncle, his father's older brother, a man he'd never met, a man who had died a few years after the war, his family told, from complications related to his wounds. But the official narrative that had filtered back to Harmony Creek, the one Frank Harris's grieving family had clung to, was a lie. The story they told, the story Tom had been raised on, was that the black soldiers in the platoon had frozen, had abandoned their sergeant, and that one of them was responsible for his death. It was a lie born of grief and prejudice, a lie that had been passed down from father to son, poisoning the well of his heart. Michael now held both halves of the story in his hands. The financial ruin of Tom Harris, and the historical truth that had shaped him. He had the power to crush him, to utterly destroy him. But as he looked at the faded typescript of the report, at the names of the young men caught in a nightmare, he felt his rage cool into something else, something more complex. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about punishment. Sometimes it was about illumination. For 29 days, Michael let Tom Harris stew in his own fear. The diner bled money. The few remaining customers were scared off by the foreclosure notice taped to the front door. Tom grew gaunt, his defiant bluster replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed despair. He was a man watching his world dissolve. On the 30th day, the lawyer from Harmony Holdings called again. But this time, he didn't demand payment. He made an offer. The LLC would purchase the diner, equipment, and all for a sum that would exactly cover Tom's outstanding business and personal debts. It would leave him with nothing but the small house he lived in. He would walk away with zero, but also with zero debt. A clean slate of ruin. It was a cruel mercy, a devastating lifeline. Tom, broken and exhausted, had no choice. He agreed to the sale. He signed the papers in a sterile law office, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form his own name. He didn't even ask who was behind Harmony Holdings. He was too beaten down to care. The next morning, a locksmith came and changed the locks. The Harris's Diner sign, which had hung over Main Street for 60 years, was taken down. Tom Harris was officially a ghost in his own life. A week later, Michael Carter called his father. "Dad," he said, "I need you to come home. There's something you need to see." When John Carter arrived, Michael was waiting for him on the sidewalk in front of the dark, empty diner. A new, temporary sign was already in the window. "Under new management, reopening soon." "What's this, son?" John asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Michael pulled a single key from his pocket and held it out. "It's yours," he said simply. "I bought it." John stared at the key, then at his son, then at the diner where he had been so deeply humiliated. He didn't understand. "Why?" Michael's expression was serious, the look of a man who had weighed every angle. "Because this isn't just about punishing a man, Dad. It's about healing a town. And that starts here." That afternoon, they walked into the diner together. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of yesterday's grievances. Michael had arranged for one more meeting. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Tom Harris walked in. He looked smaller, diminished, his eyes red-rimmed and wary. He expected to see a corporate lawyer, a real estate agent. Instead, he saw John Carter, the man he had wronged, standing there as the new owner. The color drained from Tom's face. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He turned to flee, but Michael's voice stopped him. "Wait, Tom, there's something you need to see." Michael laid a file on one of the dusty tables. It wasn't a legal document. It was the military report. He opened it and turned it for Tom to see. He pointed to the name of the fallen sergeant, Frank Harris. Then he pointed to the name of the soldier who had tried to save him, Private Reginald Carter. "Reginald was my uncle," Michael said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Your father was a hero, but he wasn't killed by the enemy. It was a mistake, a tragedy. My uncle was wounded trying to drag him to safety. The story you were told, the story you built your life on, it was a lie." Tom stared at the paper, his mind refusing to process the words. He shook his head, a violent, jerky motion. No, my dad." He said, "Your dad was grieving," John Carter said, speaking for the first time. His voice was gentle, devoid of accusation. "And grief makes people look for someone to blame. It's easier than accepting a terrible accident." The truth settled on Tom Harris not with a flash of light, but with a crushing weight. His entire worldview, the bedrock of his identity, the prejudice he had inherited and nurtured, was built on a fiction. His hatred was a monument to a misunderstanding. He sank into a chair, his body racked with dry, silent sobs. He had dishonored his father's memory. He had wronged an innocent man. He had become a monster for nothing. Michael let the silence stretch, letting the full weight of the revelation sink in. Then he pushed a second document across the table. It was a contract. "You have two choices, Tom," Michael said. "You can walk out that door and never come back, or you can stay. This diner needs a head chef. The pay isn't great, but it's a job." Tom looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. "Why?" he rasped. "Why would you, after what I did?" It was John Carter who answered. He looked Tom directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "Because my son is right. This isn't about vengeance. This is about building something better. The question is, are you a part of the past, or are you willing to be a part of the future?" He slid the contract closer to Tom. A chef's coat, not the door. Accountability, not annihilation. A chance for a hard-won redemption. Outside, a film crew, hired by Michael for a documentary on small-town revitalization, began setting up their equipment, their cameras pointed at the front of the diner, ready to capture the beginning of the next chapter. The reopening was a quiet affair, but the changes were profound. The old, faded sign was replaced by a new one, hand-carved from dark oak. The Veterans Table. Inside, the cracked vinyl booths were reupholstered, the floors polished to a high shine. But the most significant change was on the main wall. Where a dusty, faded portrait of Tom's grandfather had once hung, there was now a sprawling, magnificent mural. It depicted a line of American soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. They were from different eras, in different uniforms, and of every race and creed. In the center of the mural were two figures, subtly rendered but unmistakable to those who knew the story. A white sergeant and a black private, together in the chaos of battle, not as enemies, but as brothers. The documentary crew was there for it all. They filmed the painters working on the mural. They filmed Sarah, now promoted to general manager, training a new, diverse staff. And they filmed Tom Harris, his face grim and pale, as he walked into the gleaming new kitchen on his first day. He wore a crisp white chef's coat, a uniform that felt both foreign and heavy. His hands, accustomed to the greasy familiarity of the old diner, trembled as he picked up his knives. His first customers were John and Michael Carter. They sat in the same booth where John had been refused service. The entire diner held its breath. Sarah took their order, her voice steady, a bridge between the two men. Tom received the ticket in the kitchen. 2 black coffees, 1 slice of apple pie. The same order. His hands shook as he sliced the pie, the dessert his diner had been famous for, the recipe passed down from his grandmother. He placed it on a clean white plate and handed it to Sarah, refusing to look out into the dining room. John Carter took a bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. He looked toward the pass-through window, where he could just see the top of Tom's head bent over the grill. He caught Tom's eye for a fleeting second. John gave a small, slow nod. Not of forgiveness, not yet, but of acknowledgement. A start. It was an impossibly small gesture, but for Tom Harris, it felt like the first ray of sun after a long, dark night. The documentary, titled Harmony's Table, aired 3 months later on a major network. It didn't shy away from the ugliness. It showed Sarah's shaky phone video in its entirety. It featured interviews with the townspeople, their faces a mixture of shame, defiance, and a dawning understanding. It told the story of Frank Harris and Reginald Carter, using the declassified military documents to set the record straight. But mostly, it told the story of a choice. The choice Michael made to pursue justice over vengeance. The choice Tom made to accept accountability over exile. And the choice John made to offer a sliver of grace instead of righteous anger. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Harmony Creek, once a symbol of small-town bigotry, became a national case study in reconciliation. People started making pilgrimages to the Veterans Table, not just for the food, which was earning rave reviews under Tom's humbled and newly focused direction, but to see the mural, to be a part of the story. The town was forced to look in the mirror, and while not everyone liked what they saw, the conversation had irrevocably changed. Pride was slowly, painfully, giving way to progress. The old silence had been broken, replaced by a new, more difficult dialogue about who they were and who they wanted to be. The final scene of the documentary was filmed 6 months after the reopening. It wasn't of senators or news crews. It was just the kitchen at the end of a long Tuesday lunch rush. John Carter, who had taken to spending his afternoons helping out, was washing dishes, his back to the camera. Tom Harris was meticulously cleaning the flat-top grill, his movements practiced and sure. They worked in a comfortable silence, the clatter of pots and pans a rhythm of shared work. "Pie's getting better, Tom," John said, not turning around. Tom stopped scrubbing for a moment. A faint, hesitant smile touched his lips. "It's Martha's recipe," he said quietly. "Sarah found it in an old-town cookbook. Figured it was time." John turned off the water, his hands dripping. He looked at Tom, at this man who had wounded him so deeply, who was now laboring to honor his late wife's memory. The journey was far from over. The wound was still there, a scar on the heart of their town. But a scar is not a weapon. It is proof of healing. John picked up a clean towel and began to dry the dishes, working side by side with the man who was no longer just his antagonist, but a complicated, flawed, and trying piece of his community's future. The camera held on them for a long moment. Two men from different sides of a painful history, finding a fragile, unspoken harmony in the simple, honest work of a kitchen. So, can a legacy of hate truly be rewritten? Can a wound be honored without letting it fester? The story of Harmony Creek suggests that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, but about refusing to let the past have the final word. It's about choosing to build even when it would be easier to burn it all down. Now I turn it over to you. What is the true path to justice, punishment, or redemption? Was Michael's strategy a masterclass in change or a manipulation that let a guilty man off too easy? Let me know your verdict in the comments below, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of a second chance.